Variables are a very important aspect of research because research is all about finding solutions to problems, and most of these problems are circled around variables in the world. So variables are the building blocks of research, influence and shape the outcomes of studies. And so to understand the different variable forms and how they influence interact themselves are very important in conducting meaningful research. The globe as a whole is filled with entities called variables. So whatever you can lay your sight on, you can lay your hands on, can be variable. So the world is filled with variables. So carrying out research about variables is also important. So for this reason, understanding variables, to have a good knowledge of variables, is important for research, especially for young beginners. And this is why we have put together these videos, so for you to learn about variables. Now let's look at what variables are. Variables actually are characteristics or traits of any entity which differs from an individual to another. An individual here can be living thing or non-living thing. So any characteristics that differs from individual, from person to person, from object to object, they are called variables. Variable can be quantitative, that is when they are numerical, or it can be qualitative when they are non-numerical. So for quantitative variable, it means that such variables can be measured on numerical scale. Qualitative variables are variables that it only shows the characteristics and attributes of the individuals being measured. They cannot be quantified except we carry out certain procedures such as categorization. Quantitative variables are divided into two. They can be discrete or they can be continuous. Variables that are discrete set to assume values between 0 and 1. In essence, it means that it is either available or not available. It cannot be half. So it cannot, once you measure such variables, it cannot be in decimal form or in fraction form. A typical example are cars owned by individuals. Mr. A can have 2 cars, 3 cars, or 1 car, or with no car. Mr. B is something, but Mr. A or B who owns car cannot have 2.4 car or 1.2 car. It's never possible. Similarly, doctors in hospital. In hospital A, there are 5 doctors. In hospital B, there are 7 doctors. You cannot have 2.5 doctor. You cannot have 5 point something doctor. So mostly discrete data always are in whole number. So once you measure any variable that are discrete in nature, it produces whole number figures or data. For continuous variable, these are variables that once they are measured, they produce values within a continuum, in continuation. So they are mostly infinite. They assume decimals and fractions. Typical example are test scores of IQ, age, height of any object. It can be plant, it can be individual, it can be animals, it can be whatever. Temperature, weight, volume, etc. These are all continuous variables. So once you measure such variables, they produce data that can be in whole number or in decimal. Then the other as the qualitative variables, mostly as I earlier said, they can be in categorical form. So they place individual into categories, then from there you can count numerically. So a typical example are gender, race, blood group, skin color, book edition, brand of products, educational qualification, etc. All these are categorical variables. Now there's a typical popular saying among individuals that once you ask what types of variable, the first thing they measure is independent variable, dependent variable. These are variables that only appear so in research, but in nature we don't have independent or dependent variables. The variables we have in nature are only discrete, continuous, and categorical variables. So here this research debunked the view by saying that variables are neither independent nor dependent in nature. It is how researchers perceive and use them that makes one variable depends on another. Now let's look at the forms of variables as they exist in research. The first one here is the independent variable. These are variables that influence other variables, but they themselves are not influenced by the presence of another variable, though they can be assisted to influence, as we will see later on. So variables, independent variables can be manipulated or can be changed by the researcher. So within the tenet of the researcher to manipulate such variables so as to measure their outcome on the dependent variable. So this brings us to a second variable form, which is dependent variable. So it is being influenced by the presence of another variable, and that variable can be the independent variable. There are still other variables that can also influence dependent variable in a research, depending on the structure of the research. So the variable that is measured or observed in response to changes in the independent variable is called the dependent variable. We also have predictor variable, which is a typical example of a variable. It's also a kind of independent variable that causes changes and as well provide explanation about the changes that occurred. Then we have the criterion variable, which is also the response variable. So this variable is the one that is being predicted by the predictor. So it appears in the form of a dependent variable, which is being predicted in a statistical analysis that involve causation. So in some research where you have independent variable and dependent variable, in some other research you have predictor variable and the criterion variable. So we also have moderator variable. So this kind of variable has the statistical power to, it can change the nature of a relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. It can also negate it by reducing the strength of the independent variable. It can as well strengthen the relationship or diminish the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. However, we have the categorical variable, as earlier explained. So these kind of variables cannot be quantified except you classify. So you categorize individuals into group then before you can quantify it. A typical example is the gender, which is very popular in many social research. We have the extraneous variable. These are variables that lies outside a study. So they have the indices, the power to influence the dependent variable and confuse the outcome. So, but most of times this extraneous variable, once a researcher understand that it can change the nature of the study, then they incorporate it into the study as a moderator or a mediator. So now let's look at moderator and mediator variable. These are two variables that can be extraneous in some studies, but on the awareness of the researcher, because their presence can cause some problems. So with this awareness in mind, the researcher can incorporate such variable to become moderator or mediator. Now we'll say mediator variable. These are variables that explain the relationship between two variables, independent and dependent variables. Look at this topic here. Mediating intervention of study habits on the relationship between interest in schooling and performance of college students. So here there's a relationship between interest in schooling and performance, and the mediator there is the study habits. Now, will interest causes performance directly? Supposing a student have interest to go to school, will it directly just cause its performance to rise? Or if the student do not have interest in schooling, will it diminish its performance directly? What happens to this kind of relationship? Now, in an attempt to explain this kind of relationship, we look at what other variables do we think that can influence performance, and what other variables do we think that interest can also influence. A typical example is the study habit. A student who have interest to school may have high study habits, and because of having high study habits, then the performance will increase. So in explanation, we can say interest in school, A, and performance as C. So A causes C in the presence of B. So it is only when a student have interest in school, then his study habit may rise. Because he has read a lot, he had low anxiety, then his performance will rise. For students who have low interest in schooling, then the study habit may automatically become low because there's no interest, then eventually the performance may also decrease. So study habit here is serving as a mediator between interest in schooling and performance. So here we have interest as a predictor, then we have performance as a criterion variable, then we have study habit as a mediator, trying to provide explanation between these two relationship between the interest in schooling and performance. Now we look at the other one, the moderator variable. The moderator variable influences relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Here in the mediator, we said mediator explain the relationship, that the relationship between independent and dependent variable is explained by the presence of study habits here. But for moderator, also influences the relationship. But how does it influence the relationship? Let's look at a typical topic here: the moderating intervention of self-efficacy on the effect of a particular teaching method on college students' performance. So in this, we can demonstrate it this way, that will the teaching method influence performance, or will it depend on the level of the self-concept? So when teaching method is able to raise the performance of students, when depending on the level of the self-efficacy of the students, then we'll say that self-efficacy is a moderator in this sense. So now we can look at the contrast between mediator and moderator. Is just that mediator explain how the relationship occur, while a moderator explain the condition for which that relationship would take place. So this is the typical explanation I can give to differentiate between a mediator and a moderator. Now let's look at this paper here. This is a journal publication by a particular researcher, the mediating effects of mindfulness between grades and study habits of students during COVID-19 pandemic. And this topic here, the researcher is trying to look at mindfulness serving as a mediator between grades and study habits. Grit is a personality trait that involves an individual striving to obtain a long-term goal, irrespective of the condition that the person finds himself. So now, will grit affect study habits directly, or it depends on mindfulness of the individual? This is what this research here is talking about. Now look at this other one, the effect of cooperative and individualized teaching methods on students' achievement in organic chemistry. Here this professor experimented the effect of two teaching methods here on achievement. Though the moderator did not appear in the topic, but at the body of the work it is well explained. And in this abstract here we can see that the researcher said they use gender and self-concept as moderating variables. So, and to demonstrate that, in the design, the researchers explained that high self-concept and low self-concept category of the male, and as well as that of the female, factored. So in this aspect here we can actually be seeing what we call the main and interaction effects of treatment and gender and self-concept on achievement. So in our next video I will explain main and interaction effect, and it is very important for young researchers to understand this kind of effects so as to use them in their work. Now let's look at variables in relation to level of measurement, the scale of measurement. Well, the first one we have the nominal scale. A nominal scale most especially will categorize data with no inherent order, especially that of gender as a variable is a typical example of that uses a nominal scale to measure. So in this aspect you categorize the variable into the different class, so and assigned a number, but there is no order, no position, no rank. The second one is the ordinal scale. The ordinal scale, in this scale you categorize data but with natural order, so it means that there is ranking. Typical example of such variables that uses ordinal scale is educational level. You can also like even in a school where you have classes, you have class 1, class 2, class 3, or primary 1, primary 2, primary 3. So such variable can only be measured using an ordinal scale. And we'll have the interval scale. In interval scale, numerical data with equal intervals between values. So there's equal intervals between the values, but there is no true zero, no absolute zero. Typical variables that uses interval scale is temperature either in Celsius or in Fahrenheit. There's no true zero. So which means that when you measure the hotness or coldness of a body and it reads zero, that zero has a meaning. It can be interpreted. So it is not a true zero. That means null. So the next one is the ratio scale. A ratio scale, numerical data has equal interval as the interval scale, but it has absolute zero. So there is real zero in such scale. Typical example is the height, there's weight, there's test scores, and IQ. All these variables can have true zero. In the true zero, it means nothing. If you have height, for instance, height is zero, it means that that thing did not exist. There's nothing that will you measure in height. You can measure it, it can be very negligible, maybe 0.01 or 0.1, but to have a zero as a true value, it means that such body did not exist. The same thing for weight. For test scores, students scoring zero means he did not obtain anything in the test items. He didn't get any of the test item correctly. The same thing for IQ. Now what are the takeaway in this lesson for today? We'll try to understand that variables are essential in conducting and interpreting research, and the main thing here is to understand the types of variables and the forms in which variables exist in research. As we earlier said, that variables in nature do not appear as independent or dependent. They are not static, they can be changed. Even continuous variables also can even be changed into categorical variables depending on the interest of the researcher. We explained that in one of our videos, how you can convert certain variables to become categorical. If you look at typical example of this research here, even the self-concept was measured using a Likert scale, but at the end it was converted into high and low self-concept, becoming a kind of categorical variable. So I'll explain in one of our videos how you can use maybe SPSS to convert such videos. So the first takeaway here is that the variables, we do have looked about the types of variables, discrete, continuous, and categorical variables as the typical types of variables. Then we'll have forms of variables in research. It can be independent, dependent, extraneous, predictor, criterion, moderator, mediator, categorical variables. Then lastly, we look at variables in related to scale of measurement, and those measurements can be nominal. You can use gender as a variable using nominal scale to measure it. Then we can ordinal in terms of educational qualification. We can also use for interval scale, variables such as temperature can use interval scale to measure it. Then for ratio scale, we can most especially like test scores, weight, height uses ratio scale for its own measurement. So thank you very much for listening and have a wonderful day. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. If you have done so, please give us a comment in this section, and if there's any question or contribution to what we have produced here, please put it down at the comment below. Thank you very much for listening and have a wonderful day.
To take advantage of our learning contents, go to YouTube's website, search for Sajicare 2025. Once you see this logo, you are right there. Click on the subscribe button and the bell, turn on all notification. Click on Sajicare to get into our page and access all our learning contents of your choice.